I'm Arthur Eves. For probably the past 10 years, I've been the island naturalist or their supervisor at Star Island, um, in the Isles of Shoals. And at the same time, I was a science teacher for 5 years, but I'm now retired. Um, and I don't know. As we try to eat farther down the food chain, I'm finding that seaweeds and mushrooms and yeasts become really, really interesting areas to explore. Um, Nutritionally and chemically, very, very interesting because there's a lot going on. Um, so I've, are we ready? Should I start I did a little presentation, which I can start, and then we can do questions, or along the way we can do questions. But
Awesome. I would love
if
to just go around really quickly and hear if there's any particular things of interest that brought people here this evening, just so we
that
can.
would be
I've got
great.
so much to talk about with seaweed, and we could geek out about that for days and days. Um, so in our apprenticeship, in the Sacred Guardian Herbalism apprenticeship, we kind of start out by sharing, and then the whoever's sharing passes it on to another person there, which is something that I learned from my mom, Robin Bellantone, in her groups. So I'm going to say, Robin, would you be our first person, please?
I would be delighted to. Um, Also, I had eye surgery recently and I've been on Zoom calls all day, so going to keep the shades on for most of this. Um, yeah, I've been interested in wanting to know how to use seaweeds, how to easily incorporate sea vegetables in my regular diet. Um, I live seacoast New Hampshire, so I'm interested in knowing what gathering places would be safe or not safe, how to respectfully harvest, and also time of year. I've done a little bit of reading, and I know that the Extension Service had offered something, a year or two back, and I wasn't able to participate. But really to learn how to just easily incorporate more sea vegetables over the course of breakfast all the way through dinner. Thank you, Arthur.
You're welcome. This will be fun.
And would you pass
Oh,
it?
I will choose M.
You're just like
How are
yourself.
you?
Hi, I'm Ember. I grew up on the West Coast and I was the daughter, or am, no, was, whatever, tense, the daughter of a surfer. So I spent my entire childhood, in tide pools and such. And even though I ate a lot of seaweed because I was raised by hippies, I like never put it together that that's like the same seaweed. So like Robin, I'm really curious about kind of like the boundaries of what you should and shouldn't do is, how would you do it wrong? Um, and what parts are edible, or is it just all edible but not tasty? So those things basically would be wonderful to know. And Cat.
Thanks, Em. Yeah, similarly to Em and Robin, I'm very interested in incorporating more seaweed into my diet. I've been experimenting with dulse and arame a little bit, and it's makes me feel really good. So I live on Martha's Vineyard currently, and there's a bunch of seaweed. So I would love to learn more. And I tried getting into it, and I tried learning how to identify Irish moss. And honestly, I feel like there's so many variations and they all kind of look similar. So, yeah, ID tips would be much, much appreciated. So, yeah, thank you all very much. I forgot. Handing the ball to Margaret.
You. Hi, everybody. Well, what we've heard so far really resonates with me in terms of what inspired me to join. And as I said, learning from my sister Jo, how wonderful this community is. Identification would be at the top of my list, and then how to incorporate it into my diet and that of my family. Having spent much more time, actually the entire year, in Maine since COVID, and really getting much closer to this community and the sea. And this, I feel, is a way to strengthen that and learn and respect what is here. Thank you. April.
Hello, my name is
Hello.
April, and sorry about the volume issue earlier. I'm very unfamiliar with Zoom. I use a different platform. So I'm really interested in identification, like everyone else, as well as how to use it in everyday diet, as well as any contraindications in terms of like amounts that should be consumed safely. And I live in Northampton and grew up in Rye, so I'm always at the beach, and I just feel like there are a lot of resources there that I haven't really utilized, so any information is really beneficial. And who's left? Krieger.
Hey, how's it going? My first name is Karen. I just use Krieger because it's easy and it doesn't have stigma attached to it, about like entitlement.
Oh God.
But anyway, I am from New Hampshire, but I'm living in Massachusetts right now. I am very interested in seaweed, not only because it tastes good, but because I've been recently diagnosed with a thyroid problem, which went from an overactive thyroid, like a supernova, an explosion, and then suddenly I'm underactive. So I'm kind of reading about iodine and the role of a healthy thyroid, and seaweed, is supposedly a wonderful source of iodine. So I would love to learn more about it, and it's abundant, in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. So I'm a community herbalist. I wouldn't call myself professional, but I've had 4 years under my belt, and I'm really interested. So thank you for offering this. And I follow you on Instagram, and I love your posts. So I guess there's one more person to pass it to, right? Is that right?
I think we've done everybody.
Okay,
so
great.
far. Yeah, that's awesome. So just to review, it sounds like people are interested in a lot of overlapping stuff. We've got how to add seaweed to our diet regularly in a way that like people in our families will like, and quantities that are safe for us, identifying them, knowing how to gather safely and respectfully, what time of year, and let's see, well, what parts are edible too, and then it looks like, and a little bit medicinally as well, and it looks like we've got people ranging from Massachusetts all the way up through Maine, so that's really cool. We've got a good representation here. Nice. So Arthur, I will pass this on to you, my friend.
Okay, well, let's see what we do with the share screen. Oh, you've disabled participant share screening.
Try again.
Just give it to me.
It's all you.
Okay. Share this, present this. All right. And here we have Jessica Labrie at my favorite tide pool. You can see all the varieties of seaweed going through here. This particular tide pool gets hit by the waves constantly. At high tide, it's completely underwater. And at dead low, which is what we are at, well, we're actually leaving dead low because shortly Jessica gets hit by a wave. but we won't see that. We will get to the identification and stuff, but I wanted to go over the general things first. Seaweed is a marine macroalgae. It's multicellular. It's an organized plant system. It doesn't need the vesicles and things that land plants do because it gets everything from the sea. It doesn't need to pump its own water. But there's three kinds: rhodophyta, which is red algae; phaeophyta, which is brown; and chlorophyta, which is green. Those are the types. They don't always look green, brown, or red. They just have different chlorophylls that allow them to get energy from light. So in tide pools and higher up, the green tends to dominate, the brown in between, and just below the low tide line is usually red. However, in this picture that you see here, all that green is brown algae. It just is more exposed to the sun. I really identified with this thing about Irish moss, because this is either Irish moss or false Irish moss, both the brown and the green. There's just so much variety depending on its exposure to sunlight. Couple of foraging tips. It used to be illegal to gather seaweed at night in New Hampshire. Until 2017, it won the award for the most stupid law on the books in New Hampshire, and they took it off. Currently, seaweed, rockweed, or sea moss cannot be sold out of state, so I believe you can gather it still, foraging. Most of the time we don't have problem with that as foragers, whether it's legal or not, but just to know, I believe it's legal.
Arthur, can I just interrupt for a minute?
Yeah.
You see that yellow?
I see this weird box.
I don't know. I don't believe it's on my end. It might be on yours.
No, I see it.
Okay.
Maybe I need to do this. Does that make a difference? No?
I'm not sure.
Huh?
Well,
Because
no,
I'm just going from
yeah, it's
present.
still there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we may just have to deal with that unless you can click on it and it disappears. I think
Well,
it's
when I click on it, it moves.
yeah.
Please move this window away from the shared application.
We're better at plants
Let
and
me try.
than the technology. It's okay.
Let me see here.
And that's a really good question. I don't know the difference between laws state to state on wild gathering them.
Yeah, I looked. Some people have told me that you can only gather what's loose, in the what's been washed up. Those people were gathering for art projects. So I don't know. And generally, if it's floating in the water, I would say it's fine. I don't know. I've never seen this. Oops. Sorry. Let me see. My apologies.
I have a toddler and therefore can ignore practically anything. So he hasn't.
Okay, that's good. Please move this window from the shared. All right. Please move this window from. I've never seen this before. So let's just bring it up to frame everything. All right. Please ignore the curtain.
That sounds perfect. We'll ignore it.
There we go. So the important thing with seaweed is you don't ever want to pull it. It has a stipe and a thallus, which we think of as the stem and the leaves. You want to cut a little bit above where the leaves start on the stem, and then it can regrow. Usually like leave 1.5 inches of the frond or thallus above the stipe or the stem. They grow most intensively from like now, or actually December to June, most of the varieties, at least the kelps, the bigger ones. Don't ever take more. I mean, don't, it's pretty much the same as like if you find something terrestrial, you only take 25%. So if you see an isolated seaweed, which is my frequent curse with dulse, which I really love, I see an isolated dulse, and then someplace else I see an isolated dulse, and it's very frustrating because I really want to collect the dulse, but I can't. Maybe I'll snip off a little, like one leaf or something. And just try to give the site time to recover. Most of the recommendations are for commercial situations, and as individuals, we're not ever going to take more, than we would need, and that would not usually be enough because, I mean, Jessica and I went out together, and it was the only time, and we got 1 bucket worth of stuff in an afternoon. And most of that got dried. So this is the first photography book ever published. It was Anna Atkins' Photographs of British Algae, Cyanotype Impressions. So in the birth of photography, she, within a couple of years of the first development of photography and cyanotypes, she had come up with this. Somebody else had had written a book, naturally a guy, had written a book about British algae because he was the expert, but he had no illustrations or pictures. And so she came out with this. It was self-published and distributed to different people. It really helps to have money in the family. But she was able to do this, and it's a very rare book. There's probably 20 copies that were printed. But I know somebody who has an Anna Atkins in her office. She teaches art at Radcliffe, I think, or something. So seaweed, most seaweed is used as fertilizer or animal feed. At Sea Point in the fall or after a storm, I've gone to Sea Point Beach in Kittery Point and filled a pickup completely I mean, the drifts of seaweed are up to my chest, and you can just fill it in, preferably in the fall, so it can sort of break down over the winter. And then it's a great garden addition, both as a soil conditioner and as a fertilizer. A lot of the chemicals from seaweeds are used in toothpaste, ice cream, any processed food that you have that is creamy or anything like that is going to have seaweed in it, usually carrageenan or alginates. Some of the seaweed pulls heavy metals and nitrogen out of the water, so it really cleans the water. It also it reduces carbon dioxide. It pulls in the carbon dioxide and increases the oxygen in waters that are near it. So it creates this little microclimate that's very healthy. And then there's somebody in Maine who's working on using offshore seaweed farms as carbon dioxide extraction and sequestration, and possibly using it for oil extraction as well. One of the things which I hadn't thought of, but as I was researching this, I discovered is that in terms of cosmetic, seaweed is like a core, sort of foundational in cosmetics, in terms of collagen and wrinkle remover and all that. It's like some fucus extract showed a 228% reduction in wrinkling. So that's, as herbalists, that might be a side effect or a possible thing. Part of the diet of island nations everywhere. Here's a couple of dishes. Here's a seaweed wrap. It has iodine, as was pointed out, along with vitamin K, B vitamins, iron, magnesium, and zinc. And a lot of more complex chemicals. So, when you collect it, what do you do with it? There's a couple of things. You've got to deal with it quickly. You can't let it sit around. When we came back this summer, I had a bucket of seaweed, immediately spread it out to dry on a screen in the sun. But then the rain came in, so that was no good. So I just moved it inside, put it on a stand, and put a fan under it. And that was perfect. Just a fan blowing on it inside. I mean, outside in the sun is great, but you want to spread it thin, like this woman here is doing. And that's pretty much all you have to do. You can dry it. You could also pickle it. You could vinegar pickle or brine ferment. I've had both, commercially prepared from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. They do it a lot. Ascophyllum, which we'll look at later, I've used as just a straight up noodle replacement in spaghetti dishes. It's much better than spaghetti. It's much tastier. It takes about as long to cook as regular dry spaghetti. Might add a little bit of vinegar to the water just to break down the cell walls. But that's kind of the easiest. In dishes, I would add, just break up some and put it in soup or rice or anything like that. It adds flavor. For most people, it's probably preferable that seaweed is not the dominant element, but is treated as something like a little bit more than a spice or a supplement. If you jump right into a seaweed diet, you're probably going to have digestive issues for a little bit. The Japanese have enzymes and such that deal with that, and I think that we develop them as well, but you want to basically, because I think those enzymes, well, the bacteria that come with it when you eat it will eventually develop into those enzymes or whatever that digests it. But when you first introduce it into your diet, sort of like if you go like vegetarian for a while and then you jump into meat, it's not usually an easy transition. Nori or porphyra, which is what we gather here, are fabulous. Just sauteed in butter or oil, or you can just toast it right over the burner. It's a lot like the packaged things that they do. Okay. So this is not seaweed. This is blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. See this black coating on the rocks? That is the oldest existing, it's like a fossil creature. It's the oldest existing life form that we know of. There are the oldest fossils that we have are that. In shallow tropical waters, they sometimes grow up into big mounds, and those are our earliest fossils. It's also the most dangerous thing on the shoreline when it gets wet. So be careful. And they don't often produce neurotoxins. Now, I don't think that this cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, I mean, this is marine. Spirulina and chlorella are also sold as blue-green algae. Again, there are cyanobacteria, but they're freshwater. I don't know anything about them. But this has neurotoxins. So now we get to the ID stuff. So can you see where my pointer is on the screen? Down at the bottom right?
Yes.
You can see my cursor.
Yeah,
Okay.
going over
So
it.
this, because we have multiple kinds of seaweed here in the picture. So this down here is Ascophyllum, and up here at the top is Ascophyllum. This red stuff coming down here is an epiphyte on the Ascophyllum. It's not dangerous. There's, of the seaweeds, there's Desmarestia, which has sulfuric acid in the cells. You probably wouldn't eat very much of it because it would taste very sour. But, you know, we eat sorrel and things like that, which have oxalic acid. So you'll see a picture of it. Just don't get that. And the really green, stringy stuff is mermaid's hair, and that can also be poisonous. But other than that, unlike mushrooms, you can try almost any seaweed and not worry about poisoning yourself. You might not like it, but then sometimes you're surprised because you think this looks disgusting, and it's quite good. So one of the common names for Ascophyllum is either rockweed or knotted rack. And this is the thing that you're most likely going to find, especially, I mean, I was just at Wallace Sands and it was there. It's tough. It's really tough. It survives everything. It's exposed more than anything else. And as a consequence, it has some, it has some really interesting chemical constituents that can be useful. So it's a good thing to eat, but you want to break down the cell walls because otherwise this is not something that you can eat fresh off the beach. The Ola is, the kelp is, but this stuff, no. It's like eating rubber. But when you cook it up, it's like a really great whole wheat pasta. Fucus is another rockweed. This is bladderwrack. You see an example up here with these little dots. These are all conceptacles. They're little openings or receptacles. There's openings that go into the gonads and ovariums, I guess. I don't know if that's not the right word. Here's a close-up. This is my favorite foraging food. They're like, if just breaking those off, especially in the summer, they're like brilliant yellow green. And they're just filled with this gelatinous tissue and salt. And they just explode in your mouth. It's been used as both a sexual lubricant in Indonesia and as an anti-aging serum for skin. And that's the one with the 228% improvement in wrinkling. So that's another area that's interesting.
And lovely on burns as well.
Yeah, just generally skin healing and collagen development.
Are there any lookalikes to that, or is it, if it looks like that, it pretty much is that?
The fucus, I didn't go into it. There's 3 different species on our coast. And functionally, they're all the same. This will be a little bit, they'll have bladders farther down that are air bladders that float them. And then these on the end are the gonads. And then the shape of this flattened thing is going to be slightly different. But basically, you just need to be able to tell between the fucus and the ascophyllum. This one here, which also has bladders to float it up, and the fucus. And that's when you're walking along the shore, those are the dominant things. They basically create the entire ecosystem that exists beneath them or with them, because they shade it, they keep it moist when the tide goes out. They shade it when the tide comes in. They're miraculous plants, or whatever they are.
Arthur, correct in thinking that like one of the ways that you could ID that when you're seeing kind of bubbly looking strands of seaweed is that the knotted rack is like it's harder to pierce with your fingernail, and it's a little bit thicker, like that rubbery thing, whereas the bladder rack, you can squeeze it and it always squelches out. Is that accurate, would you say?
That's fairly accurate. If you look here at this picture, this is more ascophyllum. And the bladders are along the length of it. And the fucus has bladders along the length, but then they have these conceptacles or receptacles at the ends of the fronds that have these, what I call, they're like golden raisins at the end. And, they have little holes in them so that the sperm can get in and all that stuff. But, yeah, it's it's actually hard to confuse them once you see them both together. So now we're on to ulva. Ulva lactuca is this green stuff here. This particular species of ulva grows in sheets. It's 2 cells thick. You can eat it fresh, or you can fry it, or you could probably dry it. It's not my absolute favorite, but it's good. The other version of ulva, which used to be a whole other genera, it used to be an Enteromorphus intestinalis, and now it's ulva intestinalis. Once they started doing the genetic profiling, it has hollow strands and is what you find. That's basically what they make the green seaweed salad in Japanese restaurants and stuff. I am a little leery of that, but essentially because I think it's fine, because the thing that they do is seaweed just sucks up all the nitrogen. It's what cleans the water. But the thing is that ulva intestinalis is really hardy and grows in really high nitrogen areas, and also maybe low salinity areas. So when I see it growing intensely in an area that is basically seagull poop and rainwater, I tend to not necessarily gravitate towards it. It's delicious, but it, it's where you get it. Because one of the things that seaweed does is it concentrates heavy metals. So you do want to be aware of where you're collecting it from. I've seen fabulous seaweed growing in Portsmouth Harbor, and I would think twice before I ate it on a regular basis, especially when it glows. However, Irish moss glows underwater. It fluoresces. So my favorite is Porphyra, which is only 1 cell thick. This is Porphyra umbilicus, is what we have growing on Star Island. I have seen other kinds of Porphyra growing in Rye. But it is this brown, the umbilicus just connects, and then it just spreads out like paper. And I've seen it come as fronds as well. It often...
Would you describe to us, just for people who might not know what this looks like when it's dried, the difference between seeing like a porphyra dried on a rocky beach and the cyanobacteria dried on the rocks? Because sometimes they can both be very like slick looking and brown.
Yeah, but this it's attached at a single point, and most of it's loose, and the cyanobacteria is just part of the rock. The other part is that this is often an epiphyte on usually Irish moss. In this picture, it's not Irish moss. It's some kind of ulva, it looks like. So it's attached to another seaweed. So there'll be other seaweeds there. It generally looks just horrible when you collect it. It looks like this kind of wet rat, this like this brown plastic bag that kind of dried up in the seaweed, but it spreads out and works very nicely. And then if you, and you can just spread it out and dry it, or you could chop it up and make paper out of it, like and that would be like nori sheets. And I think like it seems to vary maybe in the time of year, but last summer when Jessica and I went out, I went to where I always collect it, and there just wasn't anything really. There might have been a few pieces, but it's interesting. Most of the seaweeds have this alternation of generations, but most of the time that's kind of internal. But with the porphyra, one generation looks like this. The other generation looks like little worms in oyster shells. And the reason why they can commercialize the development of it now is because in the 30s or 40s, I think it was a British woman. She might have been American, but she figured it out so that they need that to have those oyster shells for that generation to take place, and then when it reproduces, it makes the porphyra or nori. So it's a fascinating story of the weirdness of it all, but and also of how just she figured it out, and now it's a big industry in Japan. So this is also used for lava bread. Besides nori, the Welsh just take it, they gather it up, and they boil it to death, just like English food generally. And then they spread it on bread. It's like a seaweed butter. It's kind of a distant cousin to Marmite or Vegemite. If anyone's had those, then they might not really want to try lava bread. But it's very umami. So my favorite dulse, Palmaria palmata. Again, and maybe it's my favorite because it's really hard for me to find on Star, because it doesn't really cooperate and grow where you can walk to it. If I'm kayaking at low tide, I can reach down and grab it when I see it. Or if I walk down to the edge, I might be able to see some on the edge. In New Brunswick, I remember when we went to Grand Manan Island, seeing all these dories lined up, filled, just heaps of dulse. And the truck stops up there, they would have all these paper bags. You just buy a paper bag filled with dried dulse, and just eat it like chips. It's fabulous. Better with the big chunks than the little tiny things that you can put on your salad for flavoring. But it's a wonderful seaweed. And it's got this distinctive reddish brown look, and it really is, it's like fingers coming off of that central core. Laminaria digitata. I hope are you getting these pictures the same way I am?
I don't know how you're getting them.
Are they blocking the picture of the seaweed in this case?
No, we can see the seaweed on the left side or on the right side, and the text on the left.
All right, great. So this is horsetail kelp or oarweed. In other words, just like the palmaria, this is digitata. It's got fingers. Sometimes it's marketed as kombu or Atlantic kombu. It is not the same thing, because kombu is a Japanese seaweed, or maybe you'd find it in Northern California, but we don't have it here. Um, so we find it a lot in intertidal pools where there's a lot of flow, or else just below the intertidal region, again, where there's a lot of water flow. It really likes that. You collect the blades, not the stem. And this is great broken up into soups or rice dishes, or even if you get enough good pieces, you could make a lasagna out of it. You don't have to cook it quite as long. It's like fresh lasagna noodles. Saccharina latissima also can be used for lasagna. This is a smallish version. So this can be anywhere from, a meter long to 20 meters long. A couple inches wide to 18 inches wide. When you see this growing I've seen it growing in Portsmouth Harbor and a couple of places where it's just immense. And in August, it has huge colonies of other organisms. It's become like the world of other things. It's amazing. I mean, you would never want to eat it then because you don't know, it's like being consumed as it is. But it's an amazing plant. It's quite good. But you want to probably get it early in the season before other animals and plants have colonized it as a good substrate for growth, because it's very nutritious. Alaria esculenta. This picture doesn't have the drama that Jessica and I experienced. Because usually you find this in the wave zone at dead low tide. So you have to run down, cut some, and run back in between the waves.
And if I might just interject, better not to use the kids' safety scissors. Maybe bring it.
So this is tender. It has a midrib coming down, and it has, you cannot see it here, but it is this like long blade and a little bit wavy on the edges, and it's got a midrib, and then at the bottom it has two little wings at the bottom of the stipe. But it's more easy to identify it because of where it is, because it's going to be in really turbulent water. You can eat it fresh right there, or cook it, throw it in rice, throw it in soup. In Asian cuisine, almost everything gets thrown into soup or rice. This is an interesting one. I'm sorry. Are you getting the black box?
We are.
Okay, Codium fragile. When I started 10 years ago at Star, people kept asking me, how is the Codium fragile? Because 10 years before, it had invaded the shores. And people were extraordinarily concerned that it was going to take over everything. It hasn't. It's just become part of the environment. You see it sometimes. It hasn't taken over any areas. It is surprisingly good. The green sponge looking thing is actually kind of crunchy a little bit. And it's used in Korean cuisine. It's used with, it's always used in soup as partly a thickener and partly for umami. Most of the seaweeds are just added for umami flavor. Um, so I've never thought of it, but it might be good for pickles too. Because that's another way that they do this. I wish I could move this. Irish moss and false Irish moss. I really get this concern about, well, which is which. Neither one of them, they're both functionally, as far as we're concerned, the same. There's a whole lot of variation in both, depending on where they are. So you see this bright green, pointy one that has got a lot of sun. And over here, this is growing on a cliff face, is not getting the sun. And so it's brown. It looks like a whole different seaweed. They're both brown algae. They produce carrageenan, so you can make Irish moss pudding or toothpaste if you'd like. And the Irish moss, if you're snorkeling past it, will fluoresce underwater. So you're going past, say, a cliff of this stuff underwater, and it's like sparkling. It's quite neat. This is a new addition to our shores. Copomenia peregrina or Lethesia. It's called oyster thief. Another possibility is sea potato. It grows kind of flat. It looks like, another name for it is monkey brain. Looks like brain growing on the surface of the rock. So what happens here is storms come in, they whip all the seaweed off of the rock surface, and this colonizes it. And then it makes this brainy membrane over it. And then when it grows up, it just fills with gas and lifts off. So they call it oyster thief because if it settles on an oyster bed, it lifts off and takes away the oysters. But we always see it drifting into the beach area. And people wonder, where is this? You know, because it's like a little balloon floating along in the water. It is edible. I've never tried it, but I checked into it. Desmarastia viridis, this green feathery thing, which looks really beautiful, is filled with sulfuric acid. So if you collect this and put it in your bucket with all your other seaweeds, everything's gone. It just melts it all down. So you want to avoid that. Can you take a break? I'd like to take a break right now for just a minute. Okay.
Yeah.
You can take over for a second.
Perfect. Happy to. So, does anybody have any questions so far? And feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to. All right, well, I will just jump in, and again, like, feel free to interrupt me. I don't mind that at all. And if anybody else needs a break, you know, go for it. I will tell you a little bit about two books that I have been really enjoying lately, and I'm wondering if I can get myself back to the person that you see right now. There we go. Okay. So there are two books that I've been really enjoying as I've been geeking out about seaweeds lately. This one is called Seaweeds, Edible, Available, and Sustainable. And it's by Oli, I think I'm pronouncing that name right, Oli G. Moritzen. And this is a great one because it goes into incredible depth as to the history of seaweeds, as well as a little bit about how to prepare them, and then a lot about different cultures. So if you're interested in seeing, how people are harvesting and gathering and getting some really good info to help you identify. There's even tables in here on the nutritional values. And then it does get into some recipes and different ways that you might see the seaweeds in both a commercial place, in a laboratory setting, and then in regular cooking as well. So the second half of the book is really devoted to a lot of things that I did not even consider seaweeds for. And I knew of carrageenan, of course, in cooking and like toothpaste, like Arthur said, that anything that's got a creamy consistency these days happens to have a lot of carrageenan in it. Commercially made carrageenan, there are some cancer concerns about certain ways that commercially prepared carrageenan can affect the body, but Irish moss, like in its natural form, has been used as a cancer preventative for a long time. So as if you're looking for ways that you can be kind of incorporating food or seaweed as a health food into your diet, this book does have a lot of really cool stuff. But another one that I have to give a shout out to is this is my new favorite cookbook. This is by Larch Hansen, who you can see online as theseaweedman.com. And Larch and Nina live way up north in Maine, and they are seaweed farmers. And Larch is a prolific author and has a great newsletter and a really great website. And so he's just phenomenally fun to read about, and he breaks it down into some really great ways. So it's you'll see a picture of the plant, or excuse me, of the algae, and of harvesting. He discusses it. There's a little bit of lore and stories, and then there's all of these really cool recipes. So if you're at that point where you're like, I'd love to incorporate this, but I'm not exactly sure how, this is a really fabulous book. And I have a couple in the apothecary for sale, or you can order them directly from Larch as well. And that's where I get all of my seaweed from. So we have bags of seaweed in the apothecary, and sometimes I don't get it out to the apothecary and they just hang out in the kitchen and get eaten a lot. So Arthur, I'll pass it back to you now.
So I have a couple of questions for you, though.
Oh, okay.
So are you doing extracts?
I have not.
Have you done like seaweed oil extracts and fractionating seaweed and things like that?
No, I've been more adding them to soups and frying them and adding them to ferments. All of my ferments generally have seaweeds in them. But I have been wanting to play around with some more Irish moss, because the latest thing on like TikTok and Instagram and all of these things that I sort of know about is I think this is his platform, but watching people talking about making Irish moss face creams, and how amazing it is as a cream. And people are using it for stretch marks. They're using it on their breasts and being like, oh my gosh, everything's perkier. They're using it on their faces and their necks and being like, oh, everything's plumper. And I was like, well, that's kind of cool. So that's one that I'm thinking about playing with.
Well, I guess that's what was generating this, because I'm getting at the age, so.
Excellent. You can be
Where that be?
pig. I've eaten enough seaweed things that you've made. I'll make some seaweed things for you to put on your body. We'll trade.
Well, I just want to, and someday
Mhm.
I'm setting up a lab here, but it's not there yet. So, let's see.
I don't know how to make it so that you are in the spotlight. Does anybody know how to?
Oh, I think I know how to do that.
Oh, okay, that'd be exciting.
I think. Oh, no, I thought it was speaker view. I thought speaker view did that.
Um, oh, maybe. How do I get it to speaker view?
There you go.
All right. Well, we can pass it back to your screen if you want to.
Okay, I think I'm close to the end, but we'll see.
Cool.
Desmorestia, yes. Oh, I think we are at the end. Yes.
Huh.
So Desmorestia was the bad one. Okay.
So Arthur, I'm gonna go grab.
So those are essentially the.
Oh.
Hmm?
I forgot I had them right here. Never mind. I've got them at hand if we want to go over them.
The dried ones. Should I go get the dried ascophyllums?
Ooh, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, really? Okay.
Why not? So I'll jump in again with, because I know people have been asking a little bit about cooking and how to get it into your diet. And I think one of the sort of low grade questions is how do we get it into our diets in a way that's really palatable? And so let me see if I can get myself to the front here. There we go. Okay. So my favorite, if I were going to give people like 2 favorite seaweed products to start out with, one of them is a mix of different kinds of seaweeds, and it's the seaweed soup mix that Larch has that he sells. It's 75% digitata, 20% kelp, 5% alaria. And so it's really, it comes in just these little flakes, and you can nibble on them just as is if you want a little bit of salt and umami. And you know, one of the great things about eating seaweed is you get the iodine that's non-radioactive, so your body is like really protective against against the kind that, you know, maybe you don't necessarily want. But the this is a really great one because you can throw it into soups, you can throw it into rices, you could anytime you've got something that's like wet cooking. So this one wouldn't necessarily be one that you want to fry because that does break down the iodine. But it makes things really super duper creamy. So if you were, say, like wanting to make like a seafood chowder or something like that, and maybe you weren't wanting to use so many potatoes because they're a nightshade and you're like, oh my gosh, that's inflammatory, what do I do? You could throw in a handful of this along with your other vegetables, like root vegetables, and you would end up with a really creamy, silken, feeling broth, which is delightful. Really good if you're steaming fish, and it makes it just like break down and fall apart. It's really good. Yeah. Oh yeah, risotto. Oh my gosh, that was awesome. This is a bag of dough here. And dough is, like Arthur said, supremely delicious, just as a snacking. And you can see when it comes, it's all dried, and sometimes you'll see a little bit of white on it, and that's actually just the salt that has come out. So it's similar to chocolate where it gets that bloom of the fats coming out of the chocolate. This just means that it's cured long enough so that it's a little bit softer, and like, and the salt has come out and the crystals are there. So it's delicious, and you can just like, you can just nibble on it. But what I like to do is I like to spread it out a little bit and cook it on a dry pan. And you can oil it if you want to. Just press it down, flip it over, press it, and it'll change color. It'll get go from this nice purpley color to a browny green color. And when it gets to that olive green color, it's done, and it's really crispy, and you can use it. It doesn't taste like bacon, but I don't have bacon cravings anymore when I eat it, if that makes sense. It's got that salty umami kind of thing. Really good on an egg sandwich, and sometimes it's just really good as like a late night, snack when you want something healthy and you're like, oh, I'm kind of craving chips. Like, you could definitely go for this instead. So those are my two favorites. What are yours, Arthur?
So you had the dulce, and what did you have before that?
It's a seaweed soup mix. It's a mix of mostly digitata with some kelp and alaria.
Oh, okay. So I was very disappointed when I went down.
Mm. Why are you?
Because I had a shopping bag that was filled with dried ascophyllum, and I went down, and it was a shop, and where I thought it was, and it was a shopping bag of shopping bags.
Oh no!
So it's still around somewhere. It's 5 years old. Still fine in an open bag in the garage. It might have fermented a little bit in that time, but not apparently so. So this is mostly Alaria, I think. These were collected on Star probably this summer, and then just spread out, dried on the screen. I did not rinse them. So you're supposed to rinse them, because if you don't rinse them, you're not going to have a vegetarian meal, because there are going to be other little organisms there, like enjoying that seaweed. So if you rinse them out carefully, you can be rid of that, but you lose a lot of the salt. And I like the salt, and I don't object too much to the little guys. It's like if I bite down on a periwinkle or something, I'm not so happy about that. But generally I'm fine. So yeah, this was a day's worth of stuff, and it was, really painless in terms of just, you had a screen, and I put it on a little stand, and I put a little fan underneath it, and it just dried it right up, because I couldn't count on the sun. I did a day of the sun, and then the rains came. And then this is the kombu. This is commercial. This is Atlantic Holdfast from Deer Isle. I mean, Maine is getting really into seaweed production. They're probably the sort of leading edge of that. As I mentioned earlier, there's a company that's trying to use it. I mean, possibly because they haven't developed the markets in terms of for eating it, but they're looking at it for carbon extraction, because really the environmental impacts of seaweed cannot be overestimated. It's basically, it creates the shoreline environment. It creates the habitat for the fish. It creates all of these things, and cleans the water as well. I mean, if you're looking at aquaponics and a saltwater aquaponics system, it's seaweed will take the nitrogen right out of the water and turn it into something that you can use. So it is a miracle for us all.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
This is David.
David.
Hi.
Hello, David.
I have a question about seaweeds that I know as sea colander.
Yeah, it's a kind of kelp.
Yeah.
I see it a lot on the mainland shore. I see it washed up a lot.
Right.
I've never seen it on Star. I think you treat it just like kelp.
Okay.
You know, if you can get it fresh. I don't think you can gather it unless you're diving.
But sometimes I see it at low tide in the, when I'm out in the water near the rocks.
Still growing. I mean, I often see it
No, it's
when
just
I walk.
floating.
Yeah, floating.
Broken, loose, and floating.
Broken and floating is probably perfectly fine to eat.
Yeah.
You know, when it's been sitting there for a couple of days, I'm
Yeah.
not so sure.
No thanks. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
But it is a kind of kelp.
Yeah.
Konbu kelp is where they get the derivative for MSG. Is that correct?
That's correct and more. So MSG is monosodium glutamate. Glutamates are produced by most of the seaweeds, particularly the kelps. But yeah, it's a pretty common derivative. And that's why, I mean, MSG was done as a commercial way to get umami flavoring into food. And so seaweed generally does that, along with a whole lot of other nutrients.
In an unrelated question, we were looking in our class and I found a thing about the life cycle of seaweed. And it seemed to say that and you even referred to sperm, it seems like it starts out almost like zooplankton, like an animal, and then is a plant. Is that at all? That just totally
It's kind of right. Everything that does this, this alternation of generations thing, it's weird. I suppose we might do that. Most things do it within the gonads, right? They go from, because they need to pass on half their genetic complement, and so they have to do this. But some, particularly in the case of the porphyra, it's like, okay, yeah, well, we're going to do that, and we're going to go over here and do that, and then we're going to produce what you need. But yeah, it gets really weird with a lot of these it's like it's kind of hard to figure out sometimes. But you have to go from 2 sets to 1 set and back to 2 sets.
I kind of think it's Garibaldi fish back home that change from male to female. Everyone acts like gender is like this static thing. It's like really, really not. There's all sorts of animals that do all sorts of weird things.
Yeah.
Grow.
Yeah. Well, the male eels, the eels that come from the Sargasso Sea and then come up, the males stay in brackish water and the females come up, but they've never identified male genitalia until they go out to the Sargasso Sea. So maybe those males, who knows? They're not really males. They're just not females.
Hermaphrodites.
And, well, maybe. I mean, maybe if they went upstream into the fresh water and out of the brackish water, they might become females. But maybe because they chose to stay in the brackish water, they didn't, and therefore, when they go off to the Sargasso Sea, they have the option to become, they become males.
Like in bees, how a drone is an unfertilized egg, right? So drones have no father, and yet they are the father for all of the worker bees.
Yeah,
And it blows
it's
your mind a
just,
little bit.
I know. Well, the thing that blows my mind is that when I was young, you would hear sermons about the natural law. And they would use examples from nature that says this is, like be like a goose or a gull, mate for life. Don't be like a lobster and have 7 fathers for your children, or, you know.
I don't know what they would have made of the true science of seaweeds in those sermons, because they are so fabulously diverse, and they do
Thank
have.
you for bringing us back.
Well, I mean, nature is wild. It's
Yeah.
literally and really, really cool. There is an element of fluidity and information in it, and I think seeds are a really good example of organisms that can live in these betwixt and between intertidal zones. They can change their forms dramatically. They're pretty powerful little beings there. Besides just being
Right. And they survive in incredibly the most harsh environments or most flexible environments there are,
yeah.
and create safe environment, and in their survival create safe environments for other creatures to live.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty fabulous.
Do we have more questions from folks?
I'm a little bit curious about the whole heavy metal situation. So, would it never be a good idea to harvest from a dock, or it depends on the traffic of that area, I would imagine? Yeah, just wouldn't want to have it be too crazy and putting it in the body.
Yeah. If you had options, I would say that if you had options, it would be better to get it from a cleaner place. On the other hand, it's mostly it's getting its nutrients from the water flow. So, as with fish, you can occasionally eat from that location, but not on a regular basis. Because a little bit, they concentrate magnesium. A little bit of magnesium is essential. A little bit of zinc is essential. But if you get too much of it, that's not good. Even with the iodine, you wouldn't want to go into an all seaweed diet to build up your iodine, because that could be too much. You just want some of it to modulate it.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Arthur, sometimes we might be down at Rye Beach and see a lot of washed up, like Irish moss in particular. And,
Oh, yeah.
It might be bleached out and multicolor. What's good to collect? What isn't?
I would say as long as it's still in suspension, it's okay. Once it gets washed up into shore, it starts to ferment and break down. And so I probably wouldn't normally want to eat that, but that actually, I wouldn't eat it, but it might be useful. I gather it up for my crops all the time. So, but floating in suspension, and the bleaching is from the sun, and it can still actually be alive on the plant and be bleached out if it's been exposed to the sun. So I wouldn't worry about that as much. Like Irish moss can go from white to red to green
Okay.
to dark brown, depending on its exposure.
They actually sell it as like white, red, or green Irish moss, or they call it sea moss now in more marketing. But yeah, to my understanding, it was just different, just visually different based on the sun exposure. So I didn't think that there was too much nutritional difference there in that. But you had, I remember when we were out, and I think it was the winged kelp that we were gathering. Um, it was a little bit past the best gathering time for it. And we had gotten some that was slightly bleached at the tips. Um, and I had brought some home and set up an outdoor drying rack as well, just to try and cure it, and mostly in the shade. And I found that the parts that were a little bit more bleached had more of a sour flavor to them, and not entirely unpleasant, but like not peak necessarily. Is that something that you've noticed with different seaweed species?
Not so much. I think for that particular stuff, I also remember that there was epiphytes growing on the blades too. There's like these little, it's like it was growing a beard in some places, um, but not very much. So I don't know. I didn't notice that
Okay,
particularly.
all right. Yeah.
I'm just comforted by the fact that there's hardly any that are actually poisonous.
Yes.
So my anxiety level is much less.
So a question about epiphytes. Do if they're on like a seaweed that you're harvesting, do they draw the nutrients from the seaweed? And would that change the seaweed itself in terms of the nutrient benefit to you?
Sometimes, although they've done study with ascophyllum, which has 4 different epiphytes that grow on it. We normally just see this red tufted thing, which I can't remember the name of it. But and from that study, they said that there wasn't any nutritional drawback on the enteromorph or on the ascophyllum, but that it provided a substrate for the other elements, so that they were more symbiotic than parasitic. But that was just one study. I haven't seen a difference when they don't look less healthy. In fact, the healthy stand will have lots of epiphytes on it.
Yeah.
Are there any dangers in mis-IDing anything for topical use?
Desmorestia.
This cyanide one. So almost anything else can be put on your skin. Nothing. There's no poison ivy equivalent.
There's not a poison ivy equivalent. Although the Desmorestia probably would be a poison ivy equivalent, and there are 3 different varieties of that.
Is that the one with the sulfuric acid that you were mentioning?
Yes.
An excess of sulfuric
Yeah.
acid? Okay. Yep.
And that's the one that's the kinds that I've seen here are very frilly. But then it moves to more of a scaly structure. So there's 3 or 4 species of that. And the local kind tends to be very like frilly, frondy, pretty. And then instead of feathery, it becomes some of them scaly, almost like a cedar.
Oh,
Um, it's also called sea sorrel, but I think it's called sea sorrel because of the sour flavor. You know, if you eat sorrel, you get that oxalic acid bite, you know,
mhm.
that lemon flavor. And I think that's probably what you get if you actually ate it. Krieger, yes, that's about right. Very ferny.
Mm. And I had also looked that one up and saw that is sometimes called stringy acid kelp, which makes sense and also sounds like a great band name.
And when I learned this stuff, I learned that before I actually had a lot of experience with it, it was that mermaid's hair was poisonous. And then, you know, as with most common names, when you try and figure out what mermaid's hair is, it really gets a little waffly. Um, but it tends to be um, green and stringy, um, and not something that you would really choose to eat. You know, it's not like appealing in any way. So, you know, because it might be any green string algae could look like that. Um, so I just avoid those anyway. The difference between there's the string algae, and then there's the ova intestinalis, or the sausage weed, and that's like a hollow green tube. You can really tell the difference when you look at them side by side. I mean, you can tell that it's a hollow green tube, and that's fine. Although, as I said, I'm not sure if it's just a high nitrogen environment. It tolerates high nitrogen, but it also tolerates brackish water. So, although I've seen it growing along with this stringy seaweed, their stringy green stuff, in um, seagull poop infested rain pools. Um, I've also seen it just growing in freshwater runoff onto the rocks where it's in the splash zone, and then you just have freshwater runoff. So it's more tolerant of fresh water than most of the other seaweeds. I think is maybe the key there. But you know, with most of these seaweeds, they're tolerant to a huge amount of conditions.
Just for, for safety's sake, since we've been talking a little bit about, wildcrafting and what does this look like. So I've just pulled up another image of it, and I don't know if you all can see my screen. So, or kind of my little bubble there, but that sort of hairy looking kind of thing there, when it's wet, it can kind of clump together, right, Arthur? Like, am I
It
remembering?
can clump together or be, you know, the difference. The one that I showed was a herbarium print where they'd floated it all out.
Right.
So it could be clumped together or spread out. I would say you don't want to eat any of the. That's the one that's more like the cedar,
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
scaly one. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, from what I read, you probably would never eat enough to hurt you, but if you put some in a batch that you've spent all day collecting, it will also ruin everything that you've collected because it will break it down.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so you just you don't want stringy seaweed in your basket.
That seems like a great rule of thumb. No stringy seaweed. Done. Noted. Um, have you ever um, have you ever burnt it down to ash or used seaweeds to extract out the salts or the mannitol from the sugar kelp or anything like that?
No, I've read about that. They were used for glass. I think David might know. I think that seaweed ash was once used for glass making, I believe.
I can't definitively answer that. But is, potash, where does potash come from? I thought it was from
It's usually hardwoods.
hardwoods. Yeah, that's what I was
Yeah.
going to say. So that's the more common ash in glass is potash.
Yeah.
But
could've-
maybe the seaweed stuff works too. I don't know.
No, I think it was used because I know that they've burnt it to extract the potassium, and this was in France, Brittany probably, where seaweed would be the more available resource.
Yeah.
According to this wonderful book, shameless plug for books.
No, it's a great book. It's the one with all the nutrient info too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love this one. So it talks about using seaweed for flavor and for umami and for the sweetness off of the sugar kelp and the different salts, and that not only can you get different flavor from smoking your seaweeds as on over different woods, the same way you would get a different flavor if you were smoking meats, but you could also burn it down and break it down, and then you get a smoked salt. But one of the other things they said is salt can be produced quite simply by burning dried seaweeds to ash. This results in a black residue which contains sodium chloride, sodium carbonate, and potash, I think. The ash is placed in large tubs mixed with seawater, and the mixture is heated. And then as the water evaporates, everything comes out in its crystalline form and can be separated out. So that's super cool. And they said that it goes back to ancient times, and was practiced like all in coastal areas of Europe, and at least in the Middle Ages, but way below that too. So, and because they did so much of this, that it ended up, a lot of people were along the coasts, like using this method for salt production. So it led to massive deforestation because people were cutting down these trees, going further and further inland, until eventually in Denmark, some king made a rule about you're not allowed to cut down any more trees to do this process because it was just like eroding the countryside. Fascinating. Yeah. Do we have more questions about gathering or harvesting or cooking with seaweeds?
Becca's got her hand raised.
Oh, I can see Becca. Oh, just unmute yourself, Becca. Jump on in.
Okay. Can we cover how to use it in your garden? Like, do you just break up the dry stuff at the high tide line and throw it on your garden beds? Or do you get fresh stuff and chop it up? Or does it need to be rinsed? Or like, I hear it's great for growing things and has all the micronutrients and it's awesome for the garden, but like, what do you actually do to it?
I forget. Well, if you're in this area, Sea Point Beach is probably the best place to collect it. But
Why?
just because of the way it piles up there after storms, basically, there's probably many places you can go after a nor'easter and just shovel it into your vehicle. it's best to do it in the fall because if you do it in spring, you're going to want to spread it out really thin and then dig it in, because it tends to, if you put it on a couple inches thick, it will turn into a gelatinous mass that attracts a lot of flies and stinks. So your neighbors will not like you. But if you do it in the winter, that breakdown process happens over the winter, and you're in much better shape. But it gives a lot of the I can't even remember the glutamates, the fucosates. There's like all these complex compounds that are in there that help the soil structure. They're like glues that create sort of blobs
Yeah.
that are really important in the soil structure. And that's the main, I mean, that has the nutrients, but that's the main thing in terms of us as a soil conditioner. It really helps.
So any kind of seaweed, and do you need to chop
Any
it up
kind.
so that or shred it so that it's more, or compost it first, or?
The thing that's nice is if you go after a northeaster, you're going to have mostly Irish moss, which is small already. And so you don't need to break it down. I mean, if there was like big sheets of kelp, that would be a different thing. But the Irish moss is small and it's really beautiful to collect when it's fresh. I mean, it sparkles with all these colors, and it's kind of this spiritual experience just to go collect it and shovel it into your
Cool.
vehicle because it's just sparkles in the sunlight. But it gets nasty when you pile it up, and I've done it in the spring and then found that I couldn't responsibly ask anybody else to work in the garden because it was just too slimy and filled with bugs and stuff. So
Do you think that was partly because it was the Irish moss that had all of that carrageenan in it?
but they all have fucosates or carrageenan or something. There's all this stuff is, or alginates.
All this stuff.
They're all slightly different, but they're all slimy when they start to break down.
Yeah.
And they're all, they're all attractive to insects. So it's just better to plan ahead and do it in the fall because otherwise you've got a season of not so nice. Even if you like made a pile in the spring, it's still kind of a nasty little pile. So
Could we use it as compost tea? Like could we make compost tea out of it now, get it to ferment in that lovely disgusting way with a little bit of molasses, a little bit of
sure, I think if you got like a 5-gallon bucket of seaweed, threw it in a 55-gallon bucket with a bubbler.
yeah.
Because the big problem is that it goes anaerobic. There's so many nutrients that as it starts to break down, it uses up all the oxygen in the areas, and then it just gets nasty. But if you put it in, if you had it in a 55-gallon bucket of water and just bubbled away, you could probably tap into it, and it would be great, either as a spray or water with it, as long as you have a filter on the hose.
Yeah, that makes sense. So those things that you were talking about is like the slippery slimies, like the fucosides in there. Those are some of the things that we find are really helpful health-wise.
Yeah.
So those are the things that are lowering cholesterol levels and helping people with digestion. It's part of why like adding seaweed to beans helps make beans more digestible, or adding them to ferments can help that breakdown process, and you get something really yummy and more more bioavailable for your body. But there's also been a lot of talk and research on with COVID and seaweeds, and people finding that different seaweed derivatives have been more helpful than, oh, now I'm going to say it wrong, and I want to say resveratrol, and that's not the right one. What's the one that we've been using as an antiviral? It sounds a lot like that. Anyway, my brain is blanking it.
Remdesivir.
Thank you. Say that again.
Remdesivir.
Thank you, Marguerite. Yes. So perfect. Yeah, so they've been doing a lot of tests, and I know Larch had mentioned the alaria being one that was specific for that. So that's one that we've been adding to our diet in this house as like, all right, let's be proactive here and make sure that we're getting a lot of that. And I think as a result, I don't know that there's a shortage of alaria, but it's certainly he's gone through his supplies more quickly than was expected. Yeah. Good things to think about in garden and cooking.
Yeah, I think, well, the recommendations from our acupuncturist in terms of vitamins and everything are vitamins that are very high in seaweeds generally. So it might not just be alaria, but
Yeah.
the B's, the E's.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And a lot of omegas in seaweeds as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Is part of why that kelp highway makes so much sense when we think back to like people migrating across from that northern sort of range where the Inuit and the other Arctic peoples kind of traveled by kayak and were able to cross over from northern Europe to the northern parts of Canada, and then kind of on down. And in the southern ways as well, people were traveling along the borders, and anywhere that there's places where there's like kelp or there's just a ton of food, there's a ton of nutrients, there's a ton of brain food there, so it's really helpful, and people are going to want to be there because it's an easily harvestable, fabulous food source that also makes habitat for other foods as well, for other animals that are foods. Yeah. We've got about 15 minutes. Do we have any other topics that we want to cover or questions about the seaweeds that we've learned about?
Back to the garden and Becca's question. I'm curious, this is a bit of a nit. If you have crops that you winter over, Arthur, would you still put the seaweed on top, like garlic, for example, or anything that would go in the fall? Would you still use the seaweed? And I can attest to the Sea Point mounds. They're still there after the last nor'easter. And very good to know not to do it now, to do it in the fall. But I'm just curious if you winter over even seeds, like you can put kale in the fall and it'll come up in the spring, what your experience has been. Thank you.
I certainly would. I mean, just use it as a mulch. We have one bed that is, well, it has had compost added. But it's a hugelkultur bed. So I had a whole bunch of downed, not logs, but saplings that I coated the bottom with saplings. And then it was hay and seaweed. And then a little bit of compost, and we planted straight into that. Because we are on solid clay. So we have a lot of gardens, but none of them are actually in that soil of the region, because the soil of the region is pretty incredible. You can pot with it, but I've never actually tried to plant in it. I mean, basically the plants that we put in it never grow out of the sort of hole that we dug. But we've had good gardens, so.
I had a question about, you said as long as it's suspended, it should be good. So am I understanding that right? Where as long as it's in water, it is technically still growing because it doesn't have roots or anything. So it starts fermenting as soon as it dries out and leaves that body of water. Is that the timeline?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, one of the ways that they reproduce is fragmentation, right? So you get it when it's in the water, it's just fragmented. It's ready to land someplace else and start all over again. But then when it gets thrown up on shore and dried and starts to break down a little bit, and then it just piles up. If that pile is really thin, it's just, there's always stuff in that little span of water. There's more than enough. So I would just go for the good stuff, except when I was trying to fill my garden, and then it's like, throw that pitchfork right in,
Back home, we had a beach called Stinkies because it's just the way the swell came in. That was the cove, and you would walk through like feet of it. Yeah, but it had really good tide pools, of course.
Right. It's the bugs that get me.
Yeah, that's another suggestion when you're gathering your seaweeds at Sea Point or anywhere else. Put them in maybe bins or totes in the back, not in an open, like if you have a van, for example, don't think that you're going to put them in totes in the back of the van unless you have closed that, because you will get bugs flying all over the place while you're driving. It's super fun. Never. I did that with my wise woman once for her garden, and we got about 20 feet out and realized, like, oh, something's in here. There's a lot of somethings. Just keep driving. It's a really long 15 minutes.
Open the windows.
Yep, that's exactly what we did. And she left them open all night. And the next day, driving her kid to school, it was, Mimi, why are there bugs in the car? So yeah,
it just proves how not nutritious that environment is.
Super nutritious, definitely. Any other questions from folks? Awesome.
They're all hoping that we serve them blancmange.
We could do that too this summer.
Well, you've given me a lot more encouragement, because I can't tell you how many times I've gathered bags of this stuff and then I ended up throwing them in the berm or in compost. But I am very much encouraged to actually start using these and really adding more to our diet.
It's great, and it's really simple. I mean, almost everybody has a spare screen. And you can just put that in the sun, or you can put a fan under it and just spread it out. Because then once it's dried, you can take your time, just use a little bit of it at a time. Because it's hard when you bring it in fresh, it's really hard to use it all at once while it's so fresh. And then you go, well, is it really fresh? Because it's a little slimy, because, But a berm is a great use for it too, though. Just put it in the yard. It's great.
Mm. Oh, so let's say we threw a lot of seaweed into the berm, which we have done and will be doing more of, um, building up that particular area for planting. Do the local animals like the seaweed? Will they be attracted to come and eat that?
I don't know. I haven't seen it.
Okay.
Um,
I definitely have had deer chew up roots of vegetables that I have put kelp meal in and around, and fish meal. It could have just been the fish, but it definitely seemed like they were going after the salts.
Okay. Yeah, that would make sense.
And Arthur, are there any ones that you think need to cure for a while? I know dulse is really nice once it has cured and fermented a teeny tiny bit naturally. Is there anything else that you can think of wants that?
I have David.
um, no, I think all of them, if you're not going to eat it like that day or maybe the next day, you should dry it. And then if you dry it, it will keep for years. And then you can just reconstitute it in water, or if you want in oil. But I don't know. And I've kept it like really sloppily. Like once I've dried it, just put it in an open plastic like shopping bag, not like the little brown ones, but like the reusable shopping bags, and just hung it on a nail in the garage, and it's kept really well, and it's absorbed a certain amount of moisture from the air and probably done a little bit of fermenting, but it's still been quite good.
Awesome.
So you don't need to vacuum seal it or anything.
And I know I'm just kind of reading through what Larch had written about the about dulse. So he says that once it's like to tenderize it, he says it's a bit like aging cheese. The dried dulse is spread out in the early morning hours to soak up a bit of humidity from the air, just like you said, and then it's packed away tightly for a few weeks. This kicks off an enzyme process that breaks down the cell walls of the dulse, and the flavors slowly change. Once dulse has been softened, it needs to be used within 6 months unless it is kept refrigerated, in which case it can be kept for a year. Most people eat soft dulse as is. So that's kind of an interesting thing too, just thinking about playing with that flavor profile in the same way as we would do with our ferment. Where we're like, all right, I really like it now. I kind of like, like waiting until it's like really sharp enough where, like that umami flavor changes to the point that you really enjoy it, and then possibly refrigerating it at that point just to keep that, if you wanted to really geek out about your flavor profiles. Which, I mean, who doesn't, right?
I'm just always happy with the way it tastes.
Yeah.
So I haven't done that.
Great. So I think we're at about that magical time. So I thank everybody for coming. Arthur can be found experimenting in the marine lab and in gardens, and coming up with creative environmental solutions all over the place, but especially on Star Island. Are you planning on being out there this summer? Do you know?
I'm going out as a volunteer this year. I'm not working.
Cool.
I'm chairing the committee in charge of it, but not working there.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to. Everything is up in the air. in terms of the season. There is going to be a season out there.
Okay.
They will be open, but how much they're open will be decided in the next couple of months.
Right.
You know,
We'll be.
I'm hopeful.
Mhm.
I'm hopeful, but I'm not in charge either. So
Nice. Well, that's kind of a nice place to be then, hopeful and not in charge. And we'll go back
Right.
to thinking about what's happening at the Marine Lab this year. So if people are curious and want to get in touch with you, can they reach you at your email address, or do you have any
no,
particular?
that'd be fine. They could reach me at my email address.
Mhm.
Yeah, and maybe we could even organize a seaweed walk at some point in the summer.
That would be delightful. I know that we have a lot of plans for the Module 4 students to be going and visiting with different herbalists and gardeners and places, and really diving into building up the soil here, and Module 2 as well. But we'll have some public events for that, and so my plan is for us to do at least one seaside wildcrafting like plant walk. So maybe we can incorporate it in or make a little series of those. And if people are curious about herbalism, you're welcome to, check us out, call and arrange a time to come and visit, or just visit us on the website at blackbirdsdaughter.com. Your email address, Arthur, is that arthur.eves@gmail.com? I'm forgetting.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, cool.
Yep. With an EVES.
Perfect. Nice. And yeah, if you have more questions, you can reach me at info@blackbirdsdaughter as well. And I may be just rebellious enough to try and gather some seaweed sometime soon to put into some of the hugelkultur beds that I'm not planning on having exposed this year to the air too much. So if I do, I'll let you know how.
Right. Well, if you cover it up, it will be fine.
Yeah, there we go. So.
And Margaret says there's plenty there at Sea Point.
Perfect. Nice. All right. Well, if you want to be part of that,
Where you can back the truck up and load it right up.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that will be the plan, and that in the way back of the pickup. Nice. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm so grateful to you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Stop recording.